So, hello everybody. My name is Jason. I'm with Campus Community, and we're going to do a Celt Talk. It's going to be all about Irish culture, St. Patrick's Day, so that we can sort of learn about more of the history of this day and how it goes into Irish culture and the importance of it all. So, I have here our speaker, Jonathan O'Neill. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. Like Jason said, my name is Jonathan O'Neill. I am a professor of Irish language and literature at the University of St. Thomas. And many of you perhaps don't know that the University of St. Thomas has a Centre for Irish Studies. We're located on Yoakum Boulevard next to the Philosophy Building. And we offer courses in Irish studies across disciplines from Irish language, history, literature, and a couple of other intersecting areas. We also have cultural outreach events. So, for example, next week, to coincide with St. Patrick's Day, there will be a St. Patrick's Day Mass. And the day before that, on March 16th, we have a conversation with Mary Robinson, who is former president of the Republic of Ireland, as well as a former United Nations Human Rights Commissioner. My own personal background, I am from the west of Ireland. I was born in Connemara in County Galway, and I grew up in County Clare. Although I also have Australian citizenship, my mother was born there, and so I've spent some time studying in Australia as well. How's that? Is that enough?
Yeah. All right. So let's start off with, what is probably the most well-known day related to Ireland and Irish culture, St. Patrick's Day. So what is sort of the importance and significance and origins of St. Patrick's Day?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good question. This is something that you can approach from a number of different angles. So, St. Patrick's Day now is widely and around the world a celebration of Irish culture and Irishness. But of course, it links back to St. Patrick. And St. Patrick was a historical person. Now, what can we say about Patrick as a historical person? Anybody who's familiar with the historical method knows that you should try and base your information on primary sources. And we actually do have two primary sources that relate back to St. Patrick. One being confessio, which we might use the English term confession to describe that, although how those were used back in the 5th century was a little bit different. So it could be used in the sense of how we understand a confession in contemporary religious terms. But it was also in some ways like a declaration of faith and a declaration of his faith to God, I suppose. So we have that, and it is generally accepted by historians as being written by the man himself. It begins with ego patricius, I Patrick, and so it's a very personal account of his origins and his dedication to the cause of Christianizing the Irish. And there's another historical document which is also generally accepted as being written by St. Patrick, and that is known as Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus, who had kidnapped and slain a number of people from St. Patrick's, one of St. Patrick's early Christian communities in Ireland. And so both of these are personal documents which give us an idea of what Patrick was like. And so one of the things that I guess he's so intimately associated with Ireland these days that maybe people overlook the fact that St. Patrick himself was not actually Irish. St. Patrick was what we might describe as a Romanized Briton. The Roman Empire had made its way to Britain but was in the stages by the time of Patrick of sort of crumbling and falling apart. And so, of course, with an empire or where its frontiers are generally kind of receding, is liable to attacks. And the Irish at that time were raiding parts of the west coast of Britain and taking people as slaves. And Patrick writes about this himself. in his Confessio. I should say, for anybody who's interested in reading those documents, you can go. They would originally have been written in Latin, but there's a website, confessio.ie. .ie is the Irish web domain, where they're available in Latin, in English, in Irish, and a number of other languages. So you can go and read this about St. Patrick in his own words. But what we do know about him, he was a Romanized Briton. That means that he was a Briton, i.e. a native of the neighboring island to Ireland, the island of Great Britain. The Britons were, this is all very complicated because we're going back to, well over 1,000 years. But the Britons were Celtic people. The Irish are sort of slightly different type of Celtic people, but cousins generally. They speak related languages, although these days they're not mutually intelligible. And that I know, I'm no expert in this, but they were not mutually intelligible then either. But Patrick says that his father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest. So he lived in a Christian community where they would have, he was competent in Latin, but they likely also spoke a British Celtic language. Somewhere in Britain. And so people try and, he gives a name, a place name, but of course place names have changed over the intervening years. And so it's not possible really for us to locate with any degree of accuracy where that actual place is. And even in terms of dating, I haven't given you a date yet. The most generally accepted date for St. Patrick's arrival in Ireland is the year 432. And these come from two sort of histories of Patrick written. I think this one is from Turfan's History of Patrick, which would have been written in the 7th century, I beg your pardon. So again, about 150 years after Patrick's death. And so, in that intervening period, things may have been forgotten, I suppose. And so it's hard to say with any degree of accuracy when exactly. And Patrick doesn't make any reference to this himself. But what he does say is that he was taken as a slave when he was about 16 years old. He was brought to Ireland and he was put to work as a shepherd, tending sheep on a mountain called Slemish, or what now is generally accepted as being Slemish in what is now Northern Ireland. And he eventually escapes and boards a ship and mimicking, I suppose, some aspects of biblical narratives. He's after 3 days at sea, they make it to land, but they have 6 days wandering in the wilderness. And then, so there are aspects of Christian narratives kind of being interwoven into his story. But he eventually makes it back to his people, his parents, who of course are like, please don't ever leave again, because, it's a big bad world out there. But Patrick has a vision. And in fact, he details a number of visions that he has in this text, where in his vision, a man called, I think it's Victoria, something like that anyway. But he's carrying a letter which is entitled Voice of the Irish. And basically, he's being called back to the Irish to evangelize there. And eventually he does this. He trains becomes a bishop, I suppose, of the early church. And again, there are speculation about where this might have been. It's likely that it would have been in Gaul, what is now France, where he trained for that, and then eventually makes his way back to Ireland, where he challenges the established pagan religion that is there at the time, and gradually, very successfully, and from what we know, without much kind of military kind of resistance, Christianizes the Irish. So that gives you a kind of a potted history of St. Patrick. In terms of why this was important, During this time, Christianity was, as well as being a change in religion and faith for those early Irish people, it was a revolutionary force because it brought with it technologies that did not exist in Ireland beforehand. So, things like reading and writing. Ireland, prior to the arrival of Christianity, was an oral culture. And so those two documents that we discussed beforehand, the Confessio and the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, are the first two pieces. I mean, really, those are the beginning of the historical period in Ireland, where we can say that we have written sources detailing aspects of life in Ireland from that point onwards. Where does St. Patrick's Day come from then? Well, we do know, Ireland actually has three patron saints, and St. Patrick is one of them, along with St. Bridget, and in Ireland is known as St. Columkill, more commonly known as St. Columba abroad. And in fact, St. Patrick is generally known as the Apostle of Ireland, so the chief kind of patron saint. And but that wasn't necessarily always going to be the case. There were competing. I suppose you had a cult of St. Patrick based in Armagh, which is the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, and you had a cult of St. Bridget based in Kildare. And these forces were powerful, and early monasteries also in Ireland were not how we would envisage maybe monasteries today. So you had monasteries that maintained armies to protect themselves. And so sometimes these monasteries even went to war with each other. But both of these, St. Patrick's cult and St. Bridget's cult, monasteries that were dedicated to them, were sort of vying for dominance in Ireland at the time. And eventually, of course, St. Patrick becomes the sort of dominant force. And so much so that by the time his histories are being written, they're what we would call hagiographies. So it's not what we would understand by the contemporary term history, but they were very much written, and they would have been understood differently by the people who would have been absorbing or consuming them at that time. So they were venerative, they were very deliberately venerative sort of accounts of a saint's life. So we see that accounts of St. Patrick then begin to crop up kind of all over Ireland, and in so many places that it would have been impossible for him to visit. And it's like every little small place is trying to lay claim, like, oh, St. Patrick was here. So he becomes kind of a legend and a myth, and bigger than kind of his human entity. But so we know he was important, and a historical figure, and it's not until later then that the idea of St. Patrick's Day that we understand today, where you have maybe parades and wearing green and the shamrock even that we associate with St. Patrick. I think that the first historical account of St. Patrick using the shamrock is from the 1700s. So accounts of St. Patrick kind of grow and change over the hundreds of years that we have been kind of discussing him embedded in Irish history and culture. It would have been, obviously it's a religious day, and it would have been, I think in the 1600s was when it became a sort of a holy day of obligation observed by Irish people. But also then it becomes a feast day. So again, even if you're thinking about the 1600s, this is what, some 1,000 years after the event itself. And it grows from there. And so the first St. Patrick's Day parades actually are recorded in North America and not in Ireland. So it begins to grow and change into something else in North America. So New York actually has been having St. Patrick's Day parades for over 250 years. And that was begun by Irish regiments in the army there who marched to maintain some sort of sense of Irish culture. And in fact, I think last year was the first year in over 250 years that the St. Patrick's Day parade was cancelled in New York. And so other North American cities, Montreal also had St. Patrick's Day parades, Boston, of course, and those all predate any kind of parade or kind of festival in Ireland. And so, but of course, not to be outdone, then the Irish recognised that this was kind of a big deal, and so they began to organise their own festivities around St. Patrick. And so it grew from being then a parade in Dublin. Now there are parades all over Ireland, and it is now a sort of a 2-week cultural festival in Dublin, and it commemorates all aspects of Irishness. And in fact, the 2 weeks in the running up to St. Patrick's Day are called Seacht na Gaeilge, which means the Irish Language Week. And so it's an attempt to promote and learn and try and speak the Irish language, which is a minority language in Ireland now, but would have been the language that St. Patrick encountered when he went to Ireland, or when he was abducted and brought to Ireland, I suppose, first. Of course, much changed over the intervening centuries, but it has roots in the same language.
Yeah, that's incredible. I would have never thought that St. Patrick's Day will go so far back into history from just a single man. You know, it's hard to think that days today that we celebrate normally are just so have origins that go way back to even before recorded history was really common, even in some places like in Ireland. And so going off of what you were talking about, sort of how St. Patrick's Day is celebrated and how it sort of became big in America before it really became big in Ireland itself, when you talk about how the Irish culture sort of shifted from when it sort of started in America and sort of going to Ireland, how is St. Patrick's Day today celebrated as a, like, in terms of Irish culture? Like, let's have traditions, foods, like what kind of stuff is commonly celebrated?
Yeah, and here another good question, and here you have some divergence between Irish American communities and what happens back in Ireland, but of course there have been some crossover and sharing between the two kind of community, between the Irish and the Irish diaspora. And so some of the traditions that you associate with St. Patrick's Day here in the States are actually totally foreign to Irish people. I mean, and I was surprised when I got here when people would say things like, if you're not wearing green on St. Patrick's Day, someone can pinch you. That's not a tradition in Ireland at all. I'd never heard of that before. And also some of the traditions around food here don't exist. So that there's an idea that you eat corned beef and cabbage, I think, on St. Patrick's Day in the States. And that's not really an Irish so it's not a tradition in Ireland itself, I should say. We don't really have any traditional foods that are associated with it. I mean, the version of what here, of the corned beef and cabbage that is maybe most similar in Ireland is bacon and cabbage and mashed potato, and that is kind of a dish that is consumed. But you know, I don't think really it has any particularly strong association with St. Patrick's Day. What else might we say? Aspects of like green beer, that's also not really a thing in Ireland. That's a North American invention. Now, it has become associated with the day of drinking in Ireland, and partly, you know, so when it became a kind of a feast day, there were certain dispensations around that where you could be freed from your Lenten obligations, I think. And so, and there is a very strong association of Irish culture with alcohol. And now in Ireland, it has become associated with as a feast day and a day of drinking. And a day of drinking to excess, in fact, in some circumstances, which, I mean, I was surprised when I spent some time up in New York teaching in NYU and Drew University in New Jersey, and seeing St. Patrick's Day in New York was a bit of a shock in terms of how drunk people got there as well. But, you know, this also happens in Ireland, and to the extent in some cases where it gets out of control and the police have to come in and shut down some of these parties. But on the whole, there's an awful lot of family-friendly festivities now over the 2 weeks of the festival in Dublin. The parade is a big aspect that people gather. I think in Dublin, they get up to, Dublin now is not sure whether it has taken over from New York or whether it's vying with New York for the world's biggest St. Patrick's Day parade, but about 500,000 people turn out to watch the St. Patrick's Day parade in Dublin. So it's an impressive big parade, but most towns and cities in Ireland will also have a parade, and that's generally how it's marked. And religious, so it's not only a Catholic day of observation. I think the Anglican Church also, as well as some of the Orthodox churches, recognize and venerate St. Patrick. And so, so many church communities in Ireland, it is still a religious day, and there will be religious services for St. Patrick's Day also.
That's incredible. It's incredible to see the great difference that comes from Irish Americans who came over here long ago, sort of starting up St. Patrick's Day and their own traditions, compared to how it's even celebrated today, and how it sort of became something that started way over here first and over there. It just seems, and it's also, you can see the distinct differences in cultures just between the two countries as a whole themselves.
Absolutely. And it's one of the few sort of ethnic or cultural holidays, maybe, I mean, obviously based on a religious holiday, but that is now celebrated all over the world. And so this is something that I think the Irish Diplomatic Service and the Irish Tourism Board saw an opportunity here for branding Ireland abroad. And this began to happen in the 1990s. And they have an initiative now called the Global Greening, where major world landmarks are lit up in green light to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And so you see this all over the world. The Sydney Opera House, the tower in Auckland in New Zealand, I can't remember, the communications tower is lit up in green. Some places in Japan, so Asian countries are also doing this, and they'll light up in green. The Middle East, many places in Europe and America will prominent landmarks will be lit up in green to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And there are now St. Patrick's Day parades in very many places of the world where you wouldn't necessarily associate them. So I spent some time in Singapore as well in 2005. And I think that's when Singapore had its first St. Patrick's Day parade. So so really all throughout the world, there is some form of St. Patrick's Day celebration happening, I would say nearly all over the world. So it's for something, like you said, that started with an actual historical figure well over 1,000 years ago. It's quite an achievement that we are in some ways remembering this person and celebrating the name of this person so much time later, and also in so many different cultures and societies. So it is quite remarkable.
With that, what sort of misconceptions do you see that people have about Irish culture and history?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. Misconceptions that people have. I think, I mean, we've already kind of covered some of them in the conversation that we've been having in terms of, maybe that there is this idea of a kind of a pure Irishness or something. But that's not really the case. The Irishness that we understand is made up from all sorts of sharings and borrowings. But a lot of people don't know. I mean, I suppose I would always bring this back to language because I am a language teacher. But a lot of people don't know that Ireland has its own language and that it is markedly different from English, that it's not just English with an accent. So I've encountered that on a number of occasions where, people say, I say I speak Irish, or that I teach Irish, and there's a kind of sense of, or a look of incomprehension comes across their face because I can see them kind of thinking, but isn't that just English? But it's in many ways it's a language with an older history than English, and because of the early Christianity, again to bring it back to St. Patrick's Day, texts in Old Irish started being recorded from quite an early date, predating other Celtic languages. And in fact, in Western Europe, Irish has the oldest vulgar literature, so literature in a language that is not Latin or Greek, not one of the classical languages. So it's a language that if you spend time to understand and learn and study and speak this language, it can give you access really to a great depth of Irish history and literature and culture. I'm not saying that you can't do that through English. I'm just saying that your appreciation of it, it can be kind of colored by this tool, this aspect of culture. And so, you know, this is something that, I mean, of course, now if you go to Ireland, most people, the vast majority of people speak English on a day-to-day basis. There are pockets along the west coast, which what we call Gaeltacht, where people speak Irish every day as a community language. So it is a vibrant living force, a vibrant cultural force in Ireland still. You know, it used to be spoken all over the whole island, and most Irish place names are derived from that. So they've been anglicized, which is to say that their spelling and the names have been anglicized, but they're rooted oftentimes in a Gaelic in Gaelic language, and sometimes in a Gaelic cultural view of the world, how they constructed their world. So even a place name, something as simple as a place name, can give you a much deeper knowledge of an area in Ireland if you have some idea of the language and what the aspects of those place names mean. To get back to miscomprehensions then of Irish culture, I suppose something you know, that was marked maybe, yeah, I don't know any other aspects of that. I think sometimes in films you can get this idea of yeah, let's run with this one. So in terms of maybe sometimes in movies, you can see that there's what we might call in literature a kind of a stage Irish presentation of Irish people. So very stereotyped images of what Ireland is like, and it portrays it as this kind of rural location that is almost set in a backward time, right? In a time it's been left behind by the march of history, if you want to call it that way. And so people, I think, then maybe if their only access to understanding Ireland and Irish culture is through those kind of cultural artifacts, maybe expect to find a different version of Ireland when they go there. You know, I mean, maybe 1950s Ireland would have maintained some aspects of that, but Ireland is really now a modern European culture, very much a happy, for the majority of Irish people, a happy part of the European Union, and sees its place as being a European country. And so, you know, it has thriving cities. It has now, for an awful lot of its history and for an awful lot of the 1900s, it would have been, comparatively speaking, quite a poor country in comparison, say, with the United States or with other Western European countries. But there was an economic boom in the 1990s. It's been through a period of boom and bust recently, but economically, it has been doing well for a long period of time. And so in some ways, it is like any modern European country. So, you know, it has urban areas and a nightlife that are similar to other parts of Western Europe. So I think that might be a misconception sometimes that people have. They're looking for some kind of rural or pastoral ideal. And we have beautiful scenic areas in Ireland, don't get me wrong. I mean, you can go there and find, you know, really scenic rural parts of Ireland, but it's maybe most Irish people now, life has migrated to kind of cities and towns, and that's where you will find a lot of Irish cultural life, I think, taking place. I can remember one comment from an Australian visitor once. These were friends my grandparents met and married in Australia, and they had friends, and one of the ladies came to visit after I had moved back from Australia to Ireland, and just to kind of show you the disconnect, when my mother was driving her through some of the countryside in the West, and she said, she asked, where are all the hovels? And we were kind of thinking, what are you talking about? But obviously this was some story that they had heard about, you know, Irish poverty and hovels, people living in hovels. But Ireland by that time is, and now is quite a prosperous country. And I mean, we have the same problems. I'm not trying to paint it as some kind of paradise. We have the same problems that most countries in the world have, and there are problems with homelessness that need to be addressed. But you don't have hovels. You're not going to encounter a hovel. So it's a prosperous Western European country now.
That is really important misconceptions that, you know, seeing people who see maybe as without knowing how it is now, seeing as a poor place, sort of you don't really see it as much because you always hear these stories and sort of how things were then, but you don't really sort of think about transitions and how prosperous nations can be, even though they may start out as you know, poor maybe for a certain time period and sort of experience their own sort of low points in their own history. And so before we finish up here, I want to know, is there anything you'd like to add before we finish up to share with the viewers?
Gosh, you know, I'd be delighted if anybody who watches this and takes an interest contacts me. You know, you'll get it on the Centre for Irish Studies website. You'll find my email address as well as the email address for the centre director, who's always delighted to hear from students who have an interest in Ireland, whether that's through study abroad or through taking our classes. So by all means, if you have an interest, please drop me a line. I'll happily respond to any questions you might have about Ireland, broadly speaking, about studying in Ireland, if you wish to pursue a course of study there, or indeed about taking any of our classes. You know, we're always so delighted to have students take an interest and pursue any of our courses. And so we offer a minor in Irish Studies, but you don't actually have to be pursuing the minor in Irish Studies to take any of our classes. And like I had mentioned previously, Laurie has done some great work in terms of fundraising. And so we're in a position where we can offer not only scholarships for the study abroad, but scholarships for every single Irish studies class that is offered on campus. And those can be cross-listed, you know, if it's literature with English, if it's history with history, or international studies, some of them. So every Irish studies course, you potentially can get a $750 scholarship for them at the end of semester, as long as you make a B average in the course. And for those who are interested in maybe pursuing the minor in Irish studies, you can get those $750 scholarships for each course. But upon completion of the minor with a B average, you can also get a $3,000 top-up scholarship. And so all of those, you can access those scholarships. So off the top of my head, I can't say what those would all accumulate to, but you've got, if you're following the minor, there's a $3,000 one at the end, plus the $750 scholarships, plus the $4,000 for study abroad. You know, it could amount to quite a decent savings. So please do contact any of us at the Irish Studies Centre if you have more questions about any aspect of Ireland or any aspect of Irish studies. Our language courses count for a language requirement. So if you want to choose a language that is different, we're the only ones in the entire US Southwest that offers courses in Irish language from elementary ab initio level up through to intermediate level. And those can be recognized for your language requirement here, also as a component of the minor in Irish studies, and particularly if you are interested in pursuing further study, maybe a master's or postgraduate study in Irish studies, language, some knowledge of the language would be helpful. And many people just like studying languages, and this is one that's different. You know, it's a minority language, so it's not one that you encounter everywhere. So yeah, that I guess would wrap up my kind of contribution. I suppose ultimately what I would say is, please, anybody who has an interest, just send me an email, and I'll happily explain in further detail any aspects that I haven't maybe hit on in this conversation, but I'd be delighted to share details of our course offerings and opportunities for study abroad in Ireland also.
That's great. So now that we're ending, I'd like to thank first the viewers who are watching this. Thank you for joining us here. I'd also like to, of course, thank our speaker. I definitely learned a lot that I was not even aware of, that I probably would never learn through any sort of normal school studies in most places at all. So I want to thank you, of course, for sharing all this information with us. And I hope everyone watching has a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.